welcome David P. back.
I'd also like to begin by thanking the tireless editors and organizers of the Columbia Undergraduate Journal of History and this conference. Little did I know about half a year ago that my days holed up in Butler Library would lead me here. So I'm honored to be a part of this and this publication and this project. My article stems from a course I took last fall with Professor Foner on slavery and emancipation in the United States. A book on our syllabus by David Blight entitled Race and Reunion, published 2001, introduced me to the study of historical memory, what Blight describes as a history of how Americans remembered their most divisive and tragic experience during the 50-year period after the Civil War. The memory of the Civil War is particularly troubling because of the potent forces that have shaped and disputed how the war should be remembered. In addition, the war has become a part of our pop culture. Today we watch Abraham Lincoln and commercials for sleeping pills, and Civil War reenactments remain a popular pastime for thousands of Americans. Modern historians seem to be in a long-term uphill battle with representations of the war. How then have historians approached the study of historical memory? This question formed the basis of my historiography. The first problem I encountered was the fact that many historians wrote books on this problem before the term and language of historical memory entered into our lexicon. Professor Foner offered me an extensive list of books of interest, which, coupled with my own exploration of Butler's stacks, led me to the 4 books in this article. For clarity, I attempted to couple the books into groups of 2. On one hand, I had 2 books about post-Civil War organizational behavior written in the late 1980s and early 1990s, books that deal with the creation of a dominant form of memory by civic and veterans organizations. On the other hand, I had 2 books on some of the particular mechanisms that create memory, specifically popular literature and monuments and parks. My paper formed out of a comparison and criticism of these historians' varying methodologies in their evaluation of essentially the same historical problem: how and why did people remember the Civil War? The first book I examined was Ghosts of the Confederacy by Gaines Foster, a professor of history at Louisiana State University. Foster's book describes the ways post-war social groups and veterans organizations defined the social and cultural meanings of the war through memorial activities, large-scale celebrations, and political activism. The most prominent subjects of his book include the Southern Historical Society, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Foster describes at length how these groups manipulated what he calls the ghosts of the Confederacy. That is, a form of historical memory that is centered on the commemoration of war dead. Confederate leaders such as Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were transformed into powerful tools after their deaths. Memorial groups used the memory of dead Confederate leaders to espouse a specific vision of the war, because at that point the leaders had no say in the matter. This vision emphasized the valor, honor, and heroism of those who fought in the Civil War. In his methodology, Foster explicitly avoids the language of fiction, mythology, or civic religion to describe the creation of culture. He describes his purpose as, quote, a study of who controlled post-war Confederate organizations and thereby served as keepers of the past, how Southerners responded to these groups, and what their rituals meant. Embedded in his description is his own model of understanding historical memory, which is based on public rituals or spectacles. He refers to those who controlled post-war Confederate organizations, who were often professional or middle-class citizens, as keepers of the past, which implies a sort of top-down analysis of memory, despite, on the other hand, the populist model of these large-term celebrations, public celebrations. Foster attempts to complicate his study through analysis of the social and economic backgrounds of the Southerners who took part in these organizations, but he rarely explores threats to the dominance of what created lost cause ideology. Afro-American Southerners were largely left out of the Southern celebration, and although Foster's book does not claim to engage these alternative forms of memory, his statement that, quote, racism was not as overt in or as central to the Confederate celebration as one might suspect, end quote, seems odd when one considers the legacy of this particular myth of the Civil War. In fact, Foster admits that the celebration reinforced white supremacy as the status quo. An important step of the creation of the dominant public memory came with the reunion of the North and South, a transformation of the meaning of the war from a war between the states and a civil war into a war between brothers. To better understand how North and South came together, I read Glorious Contentment by Stuart McConnell, which is a study of Union veterans in the Grand Army of the Republic, a post-war veterans organization. And in some ways, it's a logical continuation of Foster's book. In this book, McConnell follows in the tradition of Gaines Foster and frames his work through a discussion of group ritual and cosmology, again, similar terms to the language that Foster uses. McConnell argues that members of the Grand Army of the Republic were able to shape certain aspects of public memory through relief funds, flag campaigns, and education. GAR members attempted to preserve their own cultural ideals, values that were rooted in traditional definitions of manliness, and that were now threatened by an increasingly commercial culture. In this preservationist effort, Grand Army veterans and the membership of Confederate organizations were somewhat similar. But while the Confederate celebration succeeded in creating a hegemonic culture that paved the way for Jim Crow, the GAR was unable to impose its vision for Northern society. McConnell's book focuses on 3 posts in particular, and the 3 that he selects are intended to represent the urban, mid-sized industrial, and rural posts that could be found throughout the North. Rights of GAR membership are a major focus of his book because standards of acceptance were central to the group's desire to remain unique among the many fraternal organizations of the period. This uniqueness and self-modeling as saviors of the nation was at the heart of the GAR's self-image as an organization obligated to provide a model of manhood, independence, and virtue to the American people. Like Foster in his study of Confederate organizations, McConnell does little to account for challenges to the GAR's vision. He argues that GAR membership reflected the ethnic makeup of the North, and that black veterans founded separate posts, but that overt discrimination was not part of the group's philosophy. Yet he doesn't explain the blatant blackballing of Afro-American veterans who applied to white posts, and the GAR's eventual move toward reconciliation with Southern veterans. It appears that equality and white reconciliation were incompatible forms of memory. More recent books have attempted to account for these other forms of memory. Published in 2001, The Imagined Civil War by Alice Foss offers a democratic view of the construction of culture through popular literature. The book challenges consensus school interpretations of literature as part of a unified American imagination, in favor of more complex patterns of fiction during the war. The focus of the book is popular literature, so-called dime books, that fell between high and low literature and were available for mass consumption. However, it is worth noting that the majority of Foss's analysis relies on literature from the North, which would often be reprinted in the South under a different title. Through readership demographics and literary analysis, Foss identifies the various narratives that gained popularity during the war, including sentimentalism, sensationalism, humor, feminized accounts, stories featuring Afro-Americans, and literature intended for youth. According to Foss, such accounts celebrated, quote, the primacy of the individual experience of war, end quote, rather than a single national experience. While fiction was certainly patriotic, it often focused on the individual